She remained silent for 32 years. Sarah Ferguson remained silent as controversy after scandal engulfed the man she had previously married. She shielded her girls from the worst of it. She controlled the picture. She was in charge of the story. However, something has changed. A tale has been developing for years behind closed doors, away from the cameras and the carefully crafted pronouncements. One about betrayed confidence, unspoken facts, and what Prince Andrew reportedly did to the daughters he was meant to defend. Fergie is now speaking up for the first time, and the royal family has been rocked by what she disclosed. Many people are wondering how it ever got to this point as emotions are building and the whole picture is finally becoming clear. What actually took place then? You must begin at the beginning, before the controversy and the arrest, when things appeared different on the outside but felt very different on the inside, in order to comprehend what Andrew did to his family. Since the patterns that eventually molded Andrew's position as a parent were evident long before either kid was born, it is helpful to examine his marriage to their mother in order to understand his relationship with his children. In a lavish wedding held at Westminster Abbey on July 23, 1986, Prince Andrew wed Sarah Ferguson. Seen by millions of people worldwide, in contrast to the typical perception of the royal family, she was vibrant and natural in her mid-20s. He was the second son of the Queen, self-assured in his navy uniform and recently bestowed with the title of Duke of York. They were viewed by the public at the time as a happy and hopeful pair, the kind of union that seems bound to succeed. However, their marriage soon turned out to be much more difficult than anyone outside the palace walls could comprehend. Due to his Royal Navy employment, Andrew was frequently away for extended periods of time. There would be no communication for months. For the majority of their time together, he was not physically present. Sarah, meantime, had left behind her independence, her work, and her friends to enter a highly regulated and rigorous atmosphere. Without constant support from her husband, she was expected to adapt to royal life, handle great public attention, and abide by stringent rules regarding what she may say, wear, and do. Sarah clarified in subsequent interviews that they didn't spend much time together in the early years of their marriage. They only spent about 40 days a year in the same location over the course of 5 years, 40 days. On the surface, that statistic seems straightforward, but consider its true implications. After accounting for 365 days year after year, that is what was left. She dealt with significant life events such as pregnancy, childbirth, and early motherhood, mostly by herself. She was learning how to work at one of the world's most scrutinized institutions while also raising little children. Those in her immediate vicinity could see the emotional cost of this circumstance. Sarah Ferguson was described by those who visited the castle at the time as a lonely and overburdened woman. She didn't have the kind of personal support that may have eased the adjustment, even though she lived in opulent surroundings and had the title, status, and access that came with being a duchess. Later, journalist Jenny Murray talked about how she was surprised by how hard things seemed when she visited her at Buckingham Palace in 1989. She described how everyone initially mistook Sarah for a staff person when she showed up in casual attire, underscoring how disconnected reality was from the public perception. The most striking thing was how solitary she seemed, even in those opulent spaces. She was raising a small child all by herself and was not part of her husband's travels, so she was left wondering about his life while he was away, including where he was going, who he was hanging out with, and when he may return. The tone for all that came after was established during this time. Distance and absence defined the marriage more than open conflict. At home, Sarah took up the most of the responsibilities, with Andrew's role remaining mostly distinct. In a television appearance years later, he would state that he distinctly recalled being at home with his kids on a specific occasion. However, that assertion contradicts a much longer pattern in which he was frequently absent during their most crucial formative years. In 1992, Sarah and Andrew parted ways. Princess Eugenie was 2 years old and Princess Beatrice was 4. By that point, it was hard to overlook the gap that had structured their whole marriage. Even when Andrew was still residing in the same home, it frequently seemed as though he had already left and moved on to something new. And his children suffered as a result of that absence in ways that are rarely talked about in public. Although 40 days a year might seem like a straightforward statistic, it doesn't fully convey what it's like to grow up in a household where a father is more of a guest than a regular presence. The lives of his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, provide a greater understanding of that event. Eugenie was born in 1990 after Beatrice in 1988. Their parents had already divorced by the time Eugenie was old enough to create early recollections. This meant that their father was, at best, sporadic over the majority of their early years. He showed up for public events, official tasks, and moments that were captured on camera and documented, but were mostly lacking from the routine aspects of everyday life that influenced a child's sense of security and stability. They didn't frequently encounter the daily routine of parenting, the routines that are frequently overlooked, the things that kids rely on without giving them much thought or with him. There were no regular school runs, no consistent participation in schoolwork, no regular attendance at school functions or peaceful evenings at home when a father tucks kids into bed or assists with homework. It's those little recurring moments that foster familiarity and trust. In this instance, they were mostly absent from his paternal role. Rather, Sarah Ferguson, their mother, was mostly responsible for that. In the peculiar setting of royal homes, she raised them mostly on her own while dealing with harsh public criticism. Her obligations were not diminished by the burden of continual media attention. If anything, it made them more challenging, frustrating, and lonely. In spite of this, she continued to be a constant presence in her daughters' lives, whether or not anyone was aware of it. The way they discuss their childhood as adults provides hints about how this relationship affected them. For instance, Eugenie has talked about having scoliosis as a youngster and how her mother recognized the condition early on and helped her get well. She has highlighted how her mother helped her develop confidence, particularly in terms of learning to accept and be proud of her body following surgery. There is not a single word about her father in that account. Instead, the emphasis is firmly on her mother's involvement. At 12, she received a medical diagnosis, underwent surgery, recovered, and spent the rest of her life learning how to be confident. Andrew is not mentioned in Eugenie's version of the tale. The individual who observed, took action, and influenced how. On the other side of it, Ferguson was how she felt about herself. Ferguson was always like that. Beatrice used a different perspective to tell the same tale. She defined Ferguson as someone whose fortitude keeps her going when she spoke about her mother's cancer rehabilitation on This Morning in May 2024. She referred to her as an amazing icon. She talked about everything her mother had gone through and how at 64 she was now maturing and taking complete control of her life. It was the kind of homage you offer to someone who showed up without being asked, who worked when no one was around, and who was present for the important things. There was no mention of Andrew. The title belonged to him. He had the uniform, the photographs, and the formal events where he was positioned appropriately at the appropriate moment. However, the person who reared Beatrice and Eugenie, received the diagnosis, supported them during their recuperation, gave them confidence, and kept the household stable, was the lady he had left to handle the public turmoil on her own for decades. His daughters learned early on the distinction between a father who was present in theory and one who was actually present, and you can tell exactly what kind of father Andrew was by the way they talk about their parents now, the tenderness they only show their mother, and the silence they keep around their father. However, the carelessness did not end there. So keep watching, because what followed made all of that seem insignificant. In addition to growing distant from his own family, Andrew was making connections outside of it that would eventually have detrimental effects on everyone in his immediate vicinity. At the same time, he was developing his post-Navy public persona. He became close to Jeffrey Epstein, a man who was already viewed with suspicion by many. In the end, that partnership would fall apart in a way that not only hurt Andrew's reputation, but also forced his children into an uncontrollable circumstance that would define their adult lives. In 1999, Andrew first got to know Epstein. Epstein was well known at the time for his wealth and influential connections, and he was active in both European and American elite social circles. Although the full scope of his misdeeds was not yet well known, there were nonetheless worries about his behavior at the time. Like others in similar circles, Andrew was captivated to Epstein's seeming influence and access. More than their relationship became more pronounced with time. They were spotted together at social events, meals, and get-togethers. They seemed to form a sincere friendship. The pivotal moment occurred in 2008 when Epstein entered a guilty plea in Florida to charges pertaining to a child. After serving a comparatively brief prison term, many people quickly cut ties with him. His calls were no longer answered. They stayed away from his events. They removed the affiliation from their public personas. Andrew didn't. Rather, Prince Andrew stayed in touch and paid Epstein a visit at his New York home in 2010, a few years after the conviction had already been made public. When this choice was made public, it attracted a lot of criticism since it implied that Andrew valued the friendship more than the accusations or the moral ramifications of being spotted with a convicted sexual offender. The more concerning aspect of this circumstance is how Andrew's personal. His family life started to intersect with his relationships. His daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, were reportedly indirectly attracted into his social circle, according to reports that came to light years later. For instance, it was stated that letters to Epstein even after his conviction contained family photos of the young princesses. It demonstrated how Andrew's decisions were unclear, even though there is no proof that his daughters knew this. The lines separating his personal relationships from his paternal responsibilities. Additionally, there were societal parallels that really called into doubt his judgment. There have been reports of people from Epstein's network attending events associated to Andrew and his family. In one instance, contentious personalities were included in the larger social circle for get-togethers around significant family milestones. Celebrations commemorating adulthood, for example, became tangentially linked to Beatrice's father's relationships. His decisions, his friendships, his judgment were shaping moments that were hers. Andrew's relationships with others outside of Epstein's social circle, whose backgrounds were equally dubious, are another frequently mentioned example. Gifts and invitations involving such individuals contributed to the impression that his decisions regarding who to include in his family's life were occasionally seriously incorrect. His daughters were the ones whose lives were impacted by the subsequent public exposure and the scrutiny that converted their private lives into public discourse, even though they had no control over these decisions. The damage on Andrew's family was inevitable by the time more thorough details concerning Epstein were made public years later. According to sources, Beatrice and Eugenie were both taken aback by what they saw when Epstein-related documents were made public. They had mostly kept quiet in public, kept their cool and carried out their duties, but people close to them reported shocked and upset reactions. In the perspective of the public, the issue had evolved from being just about their father's reputation to becoming a part of their own narrative. Their father's scandal would come up in every search for their names, it may come up in every interview question, his affiliation cast a cloud on every public appearance. In November 2019, things worsened when Andrew agreed to participate in a BBC News Night televised interview with Emily Maitlis. The purpose of the interview was to try to improve his public image while addressing the mounting concerns about his relationship with Epstein. Rather, it turned into a pivotal event that greatly increased public scrutiny. In the interview, Virginia Giuffa accused Andrew of trafficking her as a kid, but Andrew denied any wrongdoing. Both the general public and professionals questioned his claims, which included his claim that he did not remember meeting her. Among these was a claim that he had a medical issue that affected his capacity to sweat. Medical experts deemed this claim improbable and expressed skepticism, but the alibi he offered was the most talked about part of the conversation. According to Andrew, he was at a restaurant in working with his daughter Beatrice, thus he was unable to get there at a specific time. He portrayed this as a distinct and unambiguous memory, implying that it proved his innocence, that she could attest to him, and that her presence in his life at that precise moment served as evidence of his whereabouts. The reaction was swift and harsh. The interview was met with a massively hostile public response that dominated news coverage, propagated on social media, and turned into a cultural moment that shaped people's perceptions of him. Media attention grew quite intense. Organizations and sponsors swiftly cut relations with him, and Andrew resigned from his public royal responsibilities in a matter of days. With time, he lost his official military titles, positions, and favors. Everything that had shaped his public persona for many years was taken away. What was meant to restore his reputation instead hastened its demise. The circumstance put his daughters under a completely different kind of pressure. Without any indication that Beatrice had decided to be involved, her name had been publicly used as part of her father's defense, putting her squarely in the middle of a worldwide issue. Through the prism of the Epstein affair, earlier events such as milestone celebrations were re-examined and reinterpreted. In hindsight, that restaurant meal turned into something else. That instance was used as evidence in a public opinion trial. When personal memories are linked to public controversy, or when your private moments are used as evidence in someone else's case, this type of exposure can be quite disturbing. Both sisters were reportedly experiencing severe emotional stress at the time. They were managing the consequences while attempting to uphold the calm public persona that is required of royal family members. They had to deal with the situation's personal effects in private at the same time, with the help of their partners and closest families. The combination of two tendencies that had already existed in Andrew's life, distance within his family and dubious judgment in his connections with others, makes this time period especially noteworthy. His girls were immediately impacted by the convergence of these patterns, not by their own deeds but by events that are wholly out of their control. Neither Beatrice nor Eugenie influenced the choices that resulted in the public controversy, nor did they select the individuals with whom their father was acquainted. However, they were incorporated into the narrative in both popular opinion and media coverage. Events that put their family under close scrutiny and made them targets of criticism further complicated their lives, which had already been affected by an atypical childhood by a father who was mostly absent. Media attention which had them deal with unintended repercussions. The long-term consequences of this are hard to define, hard to measure from the outside, and hard to fully comprehend without experiencing them. However, it is evident that both ladies have maintained a comparatively low public profile in comparison to other members of the royal family, putting their own families and careers ahead of the spotlight. When they do talk in public, they frequently stress steadiness, resilience, the value of intimate relationships, values that are consistent with their upbringing, and the lesson that family is what you can rely on when all else fails. Sarah Ferguson is breaking her decades-long pattern of silence and protection because of this very reason. You will be shocked by what she has to say, since it represents a significant change in the way the family is portraying itself to the outside world. Sarah Ferguson had a formula for years, and she was remarkably consistent in sticking to it. She would sit in front of a camera and convey the same crucial message regardless of what the headlines stated, what new information emerged, or how many times she faced criticism or abandonment. Andrew was a decent man, a loving parent, and a misunderstood who should be given the benefit of the doubt. On Good Morning Britain, she made that statement. In magazine profiles, she stated as much. She expressed this on daytime television couches in America and Britain, as well as during charity events. For a long time, she felt that it was the proper thing to do, that loyalty was more important than the truth, that defending him meant defending her girls, and that safeguarding the family's reputation meant safeguarding her family. Thus, the formula never altered. However, there is a breaking point for formulas. Ferguson's speech style started to change as the Epstein files became more complex, the titles vanished, and the arrest became a reality. Not dramatically, not in a single explosive interview that would be remembered by everyone as the turning point in her relationship with him. It occurred like most real-life events do, quietly, gradually, and through the accumulation of minute details that only become apparent when you take a step back and consider them collectively. Particularly when he defended himself with Beatrice, she ceased to include him in the picture. On the outside, something could seem insignificant, but it wasn't. When Ferguson talked about the most difficult years of her life, the cancer, she explained who was there: the diagnosis, the surgeries, the recuperation, the terror, the uncertainty, and the optimism. When she explained who had held her up, the answer was always her daughters, not Andrew or the guy she had been publicly defending for 30 years. She named that image. She referred to herself, Beatrice, and Eugenie as a tripod. She mentioned 3 women who supported one another through good times and bad. It was a genuinely nice picture, full of the kind of compassion that results from true support for one another. However, it was also intentional and exact. The individual who was absent from that count was not inadvertently mentioned, and a tripod has 3 legs, not 4. In 2024, she told Platinum magazine that her daughters had been incredibly supportive during her daughter's fight with cancer. She said that throughout the scariest time in her recent life, they served as her compass. She discussed their allegiance and their constancy as well as their spontaneous attendance. That talk did not include Andrew. There was no mention of him. He wasn't in the picture. Beatrice, not Ferguson herself, had the most lucid moment. During her May 2024 appearance on This Morning to talk about her mother's recuperation, she spoke about Ferguson with the type of tenderness that comes only from someone who has truly earned it through years of presence. She referred to her as an amazing icon. She characterized her fortitude as something that personally sustains her. She claimed that at 64, her mother was at last maturing and becoming her true self. The interview went on for a long time. It was a crucial one, a time when Beatrice might have used it to show her family's unity or to defend her father. There was not a single mention of Andrew. No direct word could have conveyed the story as well as the daughter's silence when she publicly discussed her family on national television. Ferguson had been controlling what was said about Andrew for 30 years. He was not included in the image she decided to paint, and now her own daughter was discussing their family on public television. In the interim between the meticulously planned public appearances, Ferguson did utter something darker. According to people close to the family, she was distraught after various incidents, revelations, and the arrest. She was afraid for herself as much as for Andrew. Her own correspondence had been mentioned in the Epstein documents. Her non-profit had shut down, she had lost her title. The Crown has taken back her residence at Royal Lodge. Her entire second act revolved around portraying herself as a robust, rehabilitated lady who had withstood the worst the tabloids could throw at her and come out stronger. And now his image was collapsing with that one. She disappeared. The United Arab Emirates came after France and the Austrian Alps. Additionally, the three ladies she had so kindly detailed in interviews, who supported one another, were left standing in her absence. Eugenie and Beatrice continued. They went to royal events, they kept their kids safe. They didn't discuss their mother or father in public. Three women who had lived their entire lives dealing with the fallout from other people's decisions continued to do so, bearing the burden and keeping quiet. However, the story is far from finished because Andrew's actions continued to have uncontrollable, unmanageable, and unexplainable effects on his kids. By the beginning of 2026, Andrew's isolation from his girls was no longer something that was assumed or discreetly noted in private. Major media outlets were freely reporting on it. Several news outlets reported in January that Princess Eugenie had completely severed ties with her father. These reports stated that she had stopped talking to him and had not paid him a visit throughout the Christmas season. Susanna Reid discussed the story in public on Good Morning Britain. Commentators pointed out that Eugenie's absence from her father's side was not accidental or symbolic, especially during a customarily family-focused holiday like Christmas. It represented a more profound, underlying change. While private assistance may never be completely ruled out, public deeds frequently convey their own tale, according to royal analyst Afua Hagan. In this instance, Eugenie's choice to keep her distance from her father in public places suggested that a boundary was being established. That limit seemed to be based on values as much as individual feelings. It was suggested that, especially when public life and reputation are involved, keeping distance eventually becomes more about what a person is prepared to be connected with than it is about loyalty. That distinction carried a lot of weight for someone like Eugenie, who had lived her entire life under scrutiny and who had always known what it meant to be next to someone. In contrast, Princess Beatrice appeared to adopt a more cautious strategy. She was still in contact with some people and had not completely cut ties. Beatrice extended an invitation to her father to attend her daughter's private family christening in December 2025. However, even that moment was kept under strict control. They did not appear together in public photos, make any joint appearances, or make any remarks that could be seen as a more general expression of support. The invitation itself was a little, intimate act that acknowledged as a personal connection without becoming public. Then, in February 2026, things became really bad. On his 66th birthday, Andrew was detained at his home, an incident that quickly garnered national notice. The arrest circumstances, along with continued examination of his prior affiliations and actions, rekindled the issue's prominence in the media. Both Beatrice and Eugenie said nothing in the immediate aftermath. There were no obvious reactions, no public declarations, and no attempts at justification or defense. Rather, they disappeared from sight. According to reports, their next plans have been modified, with timetables and appearances being re-evaluated. It appeared that controlling the impact had taken precedence over directly addressing the problem. According to people with direct knowledge of the event, their response was characterized as extremely uneasy rather than defensive or contemptuous. Concerns were raised not only about what had already occurred but also about what might still come to light, what other records might be made public, and what other truths might surface. That kind of reaction implies a disconnect between reality and expectations, where things happen in ways that make it necessary to re-evaluate what was previously believed. The repercussions were not limited to personal life. They influenced how both women were perceived and where they might be seen as they entered their public responsibilities. One of Reports that they had been barred from royal Ascot in 2026 provided the most obvious examples. Coverage at the time claimed that the decision was related to the wider consequences of their families' affiliations. For Beatrice and Eugenie, this meant losing out on an occasion that had long been a part of their calendar, a part of royal history, and a part of who they were as royal family members. The decision was made about them, not about them. Despite having their own unique identities, jobs, and charity endeavors, they continued to be evaluated in light of their father's behavior. This was presented by commentators as a component of a broader problem, the significance of a family name. The York name, which simultaneously conferred recognition and status, had grown more complex. The daughters were unable to put it aside. It was connected to their public duties, history, and identity. The absence of control is what makes this scenario more challenging. The choices that resulted in the scandal were not influenced by Beatrice or Eugenie. Being born into this family was not their choice. Their father's affiliations and actions were not determined by them. However, its impacts are still felt by them. Their decisions now center on how to react, how to strike a balance between private and public obligations, and how to proceed in an environment they did not create. Now Beatrice and Eugenie's goal is not only to avoid controversy, but also to define who they are in it, choosing what aspects of that heritage they want to preserve. And all of that is a result of what their father did to them, his carelessness, his bad judgment, and the choices he made that had an impact on everyone around him in addition to himself. Now that you've seen everything, what do you think? Does it alter your perception of him? Which moments struck you in a different way? What was the most important revelation? Let go. Tell us what you think about all of this by leaving a comment.